So what I'm going to do today is really chat about Liz Frink, talk a little bit about the context of her work and her life, sort of chat about the pieces that are here, answer questions, and encourage you all to also spend a fair bit of time looking at the sculptures, because they repay that sort of attention. So I'm going to start with Liz. So Liz was born in 1930, and she was born in East Anglia and grew up there for most of her childhood, although she had an army childhood, so she did move around with her father, but her grandparents lived in East Anglia, and so that was a sort of almost the family home. And that was quite a rural upbringing, a very rural upbringing actually. And so Liz was very immersed in the natural world. She and her brother Tim were very immersed in the natural world when they were young children, and allowed pretty much to roam pretty free, and also encouraged, when the war came and food shortages started to appear, to go out at the age, from about the age of 11, to go out with a gun to shoot game and rabbits and hares and anything that would add to the family pot of food. So she had this close relationship then with animals and birds, you know, from that sort of hunter type perspective, which is quite unusual. The war made a great impact on Liz, and it was something she often referred back to. So they were in East Anglia. She was surrounded by the airfields of East Anglia. She was used to the bombing raids that were starting to go over to London. So they would get, you know, and there would be dogfights above the fields that she grew up in, and that they were living in at that time. She remembers planes being, you know, hurtling out of the sky and coming down and landing, and her brother and other children of where she was sort of going off to investigate. And so that was a formative time in many ways, and very different from sort of later generations, certainly my generation of experience of what it's like to grow up in the countryside. She was evacuated and sent down to Devon for safety reasons. Her mother, Jean, had a friend who lived in Exmouth, so she sent her children for safety away from this area of sort of aerial dogfights and blitz raids on London to what she thought was going to be a sort of secure environment in Exmouth. But actually that was probably the most, in terms of Liz's life, the most horrifying experience that she had in terms of aggression, and that she was walking with some school friends along the seafront at Exmouth, and they saw these planes coming in over the sea, low and over the sea. And then they were being machine gunned and bombs were being dropped on Exmouth. Quite a few people, about I think 30 or 40 people, died in that sort of air raid. She survived. They all went and hid underneath a bench in a shelter, a seaside shelter. And but again, so aggression was something that she knew about, and. Also while she was in Exmouth, she was very interested in drawing. She started to become interested in drawing when she was visiting Dorset. Her father was, I think the family came down to live somewhere near Lulworth while her father was stationed in the area. And they stayed with some old family friends, and the eldest son started to do lots of drawing with Liz, and that's when she started drawing. And her drawing from that time onwards was not like a child's drawing. It was big, it was strong, it was confident. This was a sort of natural way of expressing herself through these huge, very large drawings, and that's how she always drew. You know, we don't have in the archive any little sketchbooks. We don't have little drawings of Liz's. They're all big drawings. This is how she's thinking things through. And actually, if you just look at these drawings around here, you can see that actually the paper is almost quite never big enough. You know, quite often it's sort of spreading off. You feel as if she's going off into space. So when she was at Exmouth, she was also encouraged to go to drawing lessons at the local convent. And there was a nun there in particular who introduced her to classical art, encouraged her to borrow books, supported her in the drawings, and so by the time she got to her late teens, she'd really decided that what she wanted to be was an artist. This is what I want to be. I'm going to be an artist, but I don't come from an artist family, so how do you do it? So her mother, because her father was still in the army, actually took her up and her drawings to see Brian Robertson, a friend who was a very important art critic and eventually director of the Whitechapel Art Gallery. He saw the drawings and he recommended Guildford Art School. And so she attended at Guildford Art School, and then she went on to Chelsea. And by the time she was at Chelsea, she had decided that she was not going to be a painter as she had originally thought that she would be, that it was sculpture that worked for her. Her tutors in sculpture were Bernard Meadows and Willie Sukop, and they really encouraged her to think about the sort of new ways in terms of British sculpture that they were exploring. To understand that, you need to know a little bit about Bernard Meadows. So Bernard Meadows had worked and had been an assistant for Henry Moore, and that's the sort of pre-war art world of truth to materials, carving, sort of taking things back from a block, arriving at a form, and very sort of earth-bound objects. So, you know, Moore and Hepworth, you've got this very solid type, weighty type sculptures. Bernard Meadows was very, very reactive against that, probably, you know, having been an assistant and wanting to find his own sort of language. So he introduced his students to more European ideas, and so in particular the work of Giacometti. And Liz just completely fell in love with the work of Giacometti, mostly because of the way he worked. So you have this young girl who likes drawing, she thinks through drawing, she does these big drawings. And those are very immediate and very fresh. And if you're going to do that sculpturally, you've got to find a medium that allows you to work very fast. So this idea of building up an armature, so an armature is sort of like the skeleton. You build up a skeleton and then building on top of that skeleton with plaster, working the plaster in all sorts of different ways, using axes, rasps, all sorts of things, being able to sort of stuff the plaster full of bits of wood, broken materials found, bits of scrim or bits of newspaper and so on. So you could build up very rapidly. You could build up your sculpture very rapidly. You could work at it quite quickly, and you could arrive at a form. That totally suited Liz. And so that became her chosen medium. She did sometimes work with clay. Clay is much slower and more ponderous, so she mainly tended to do that for the portrait heads that she was commissioned to do throughout her working life. So she could do realism. If she was asked to do a portrait, then you had a wonderful portrait of that person. But in terms of her own expression of what she wanted to talk about, she wanted to break free from realism, and sort of to find more expressive forms, so that she's using the language of the figure, but she's expressing feelings that she felt were sort of, you know, every artist, I suppose, has to work out a technique that allows them to express what it interests them. So in Liz's terms, astonishingly, again really, as a late teens, early 20s, it was really humanity that interested her. And because of her war experience, because of after the war, coming into this age where there's this known potential that with the dropping of the atom bombs that we are capable of destroying humanity, destroying the planet, those are the things that mattered to her. And so she has a medium that she knows that she can work with. She's very disciplined as an artist. She takes herself into her studio pretty well every day, every morning, works there for about 5 or 6 hours, shuts out the rest of the world, and creates this magic space where she works out her ideas through paper, she works her ideas through working with plaster. Then you've got to think, what forms am I going to do? Am I going to, sort of, what is it? How can I express these complex things? Because it's not like writing an essay, it's not like using words. You've got to convey your feelings, you've got to express those. And she's dealing with quite complex things, quite difficult things for a young person to deal with, for an older person. Our capacity for brutality, our capacity for acts of terror, our capacity for compassion, our vulnerability, the sort of diverse nature of human beings. And so she arrives at this device which has its origins in myth, and that is shape-shifting. This idea of using two forms. So you could have a bird and a beast, you can have a beast and a human being, you can have a beast and a bird. You have this which is why we ended up with this title of transformation. You have this shifting of shape. You have this thing which is subversive in the fact that it's not totally realistic. It alludes to myths, but she would say that she always created her own myths. So she doesn't, on the whole, tend to directly refer to a particular known myth. She's just using the devices of myths. And so when we look around here, we can see, well, that there's an exception to that. There's a very early drawing which we've included, which is over there, that's titled Cahulan. Cahulan is an Irish mythological character, who, within that Irish mythological series of almost sagas, the story behind the myth really is Cahulan's need to go to war, the desire by people who love and know him to stop him going to war, and that includes his horse, Leomaka, and actually the tragedy of the myth in the fact that eventually he does go to war and he regrets it, and at that moment of regret he dies. And so that and that sort of regret, that side of our capacity for aggression and our need for conflict has got this other side of huge vulnerability and regret, and the outcomes from it. So in the some of the early works, we have a raven. We have the raven on the drawing here with Cahulan. The raven is this symbol of aggression. Frink also linked it to the aggressive nature of the sort of war planes. So we have this sense of sort of flight. We have an earlyish piece which is about this sort of dead hen, this dead creature, we've got lots of work in the archive which show other models and maquettes where she is exploring these twisted forms. And this comes from her teenage years when she was out hunting, and she would bring back the sort of rabbits and the other things and hang them up in the outhouses. Sometimes they would go into the pot, sometimes they were forgotten about, and then you would end up with these twisted forms. So with her sculptural eye, she became very interested in that. We have this brooding vulture which sits there. The early work shows the influence of Giacometti and the sort of European tradition at that time of very expressive surfaces. So from a sculptural point of view, the surfaces, it's not just the subject matter, that the surfaces themselves are also sort of agonized, they're craggy, they are deeply pitted, they are sort of, there's dark hidden caverns, and they are ravaged surfaces. She achieves this by working with very, very wet plaster. So she brings those two things together. She's always using the methodology of her work alongside her desire to express a particular ideas, and to sort of understand them herself. When she's working in this very wet, plastery sort of way, to arrive at these very ravaged surfaces, she's drawing, and pretty well only in ink. So if you look over there, there are mainly ink drawings. There's a horse and a beast head. I'll come over here and look back at you. And what you see with the drawings reflects what she's doing with her sculpture. So with these ink drawings, she's using ink because it, like the plaster, it's very wet, it's very liquid. She can freely sort of work with that on the paper. She never used almost never used high quality paper. Sort of very thin draftsman sort of paper, bits of brown paper, all sorts of things. And then she's working with this wonderful sort of wet ink in which she can allude to, I suppose, how to express it, sort of allude to whatever feeling she's trying to convey, but they're not fixed feelings. It's very much how we then interpret it. And it means also that she can enjoy the runs and the splashes. She can sort of work in that way. You can see that also with the sort of horse head. In these early years when she's working in London, the London art scene after the First World War was very full of mainly male sculptors, and quite often, in terms of this sort of the new wave of sculptors, they tended to be men who'd been at war and come back and then gone to art college sort of much later. And they tended to be lumped together as this sort of group of artists known as the geometry of fear, the age of anxiety, sort of expressing the anxiety of the time, the sort of post-war sort of traumas, the sort of realization of what had happened in the war, the concentration camps, what was happening with the dropping and testing of atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs. And Liz uniquely was sort of gathered into that group, although she wasn't shown at the Venice Biennale show at that time. It was only the male artists who were sort of taken over there and shown in that sort of period. But in lots of exhibitions in London. So her work was being seen very early on in these really important exhibitions. But then there's this new wave of thinking coming over from America, this sort of reinterpretation of expressionism. Some of the artists who fled Europe before the war and during the war have gone to America, and this sort of return from America of ideas that, and amongst those, of course, you've got people, then British artists going over, like Anthony Caro, coming back with the ideas of the next, a new way, the next sort of form of sculptural language. And so we have sort of abstraction, sort of new versions of abstraction and construction, and big engineering sort of works, and sort of welding and really that the figurative art is no longer, or even semi-figurative art is no longer seen as quite so relevant. And it's at this period that Liz starts to explore these very abstract heads. So the heads come from this sort of period, and they go along with the thought, or her exploration is, does she want to become an purely sort of constructivist type artist? Does she want to follow in with the pop art? Does she want to follow in with all these new movements that are developing? And she makes a very conscious decision that she is not going to do that, that actually she just knows herself, she knows what interests her, and she's going to stay with the figure, even if she's playing around with the figure. So the head becomes an important thing. So you have these heads in isolation from the figure. They're still figurative, but they're all abstracted heads. They can be animal heads, they can be fish heads. Sometimes it's just the idea of the carapace, the sort of shell. And what becomes evident, I think, is that at this point, this is when she really starts to feel that the head itself is this, she sees it almost, and she talks about it as a vessel for feeling. Once Liz has identified a motif that's going to be interesting to her, that motif stays with her for the rest of her working life. She reinterprets it, she revisits it. It's never the same. It always sort of moves on. She changes the way she works with it. She might change the desert quartet heads that are outside. These ones are modelled with very wet plaster, so she's slapping the plaster on, building it up, using rafts, cutting it back, and so on. With the desert quartet heads, not only has she changed scale, but she's changed technique. She allows those heads to become totally dry, the plaster to become totally dry, and she's a carver. So no longer is she a modeller, she's a carver. So she moves on. And when you're looking at Liz's work, it's very rewarding to actually see how she reinterprets, reinvigorates a particular idea. So we'll come over to these now. I'll move over to there. Quite early on, Liz was given a lot of public commissions. She was given commissions for lots of the rebuilding of bombed cities. So we have her given work for London, Bethnal Green, Blind Beggar and Dog. We have her given work in Coventry. So although she's still very young, she is given these big public commissions for the new schools that are being built, with this sort of for the new towns that are being built, with the idea that this world is going to be a better place, and this sort of new social awareness. So we're going to have better schools, we're going to have better towns, we're going to have more green spaces, we're going to be looking after people after they've gone through the war. And amongst those early commissions was for a school in London, and she was allowed to choose her own topic when she was sort of working with the commissioners, and she suggested that she would like to do a birdman, because she's interested in this sort of shape-shifting. And the commissioners are more than happy for her to do that. And so she did the first birdman that she did. She actually, because it was a commission, she actually did that one in clay. And there wasn't enough funds to have it cast in bronze. So quite a lot of the early commissions were cast in concrete. So that sculpture actually eventually became damaged, and she decided that she would do a second birdman for the school, and this is the birdman that she created for that. Quite a different figure. So why the idea of birdman? Why was she so interested in this idea of birdman? One of the reasons was because she was an avid reader of magazines like Life, Picture Post, photojournalism. She loved sort of photojournalism. And there was an article in a Life magazine about Leo Valentin, who was known as the Birdman. He built himself this rather extraordinary apparatus out of wood and canvas, in which he would leap from an aeroplane and open up the wings and fly and slowly descend, pull the parachute and then float to the ground. But sadly, at a rather major air show in Liverpool, the fuselage of his wings hit the aeroplane, and sadly he plummeted to his death. So that was in this Life magazine, and those pages from that Life magazine were plastered all over her studio. So it became a very important motif and image. And if you look at that Life magazine journal, inside it's about Leo Valentin. On the front page, it's dropping the first hydrogen bomb in the Pacific. So you have these two parallels. And most significantly, I suppose with both of them, it's this sort of sense of Leo Valentin felt that he was invulnerable. And perhaps we feel that we're invulnerable. And certainly testing of nuclear, there's big questions around, our capacity for self-destruction. How closely do we look at that? How closely do we look at, our capacity for harming other people? But this has gone into another scale. This is not just war and killing, other human beings or destroying a landscape. This is total annihilation. And so the Birdman became a very important area of exploration for Link. And we have other birdmen here. We have other falling figures. We have birds that are half bird, half beast. That birdman there, that little horizontal birdman, relates to a commission that she was done for the new airport that they were building in Manchester as part of improving infrastructure as well. And the full-scale piece has had a very troubled history because right from the start it has created controversy. Miraculously, all of Liz Frink's public sculptures are intact and have remained, and gradually people often become very fond of them and welcome them into their sort of community. They might not like them to begin with, but gradually they've sort of tended to sort of bed themselves down into the place. I can honestly say that the Birdman at Manchester Airport still has very troubled relationships with its audience. People are still not very comfortable about the idea of this splintered, fractured image, in terms of, the security of flight. Let's move on. So as I said, once Liz had arrived at a sort of motif, a particular image, she's tended to keep with those images, but rework them quite radically. So we know that she was interested in this idea of the head. It's very, very important to her. And sort of what's going on in the thinking. How do we function and think as human beings? How do you account for our actions? And in the 60s, because she had decided that she was not going to follow the current wave of art fashion, she needed some time out. So she and her second husband, Ted, bought almost a whole village, actually, but down in France, this sort of a place called Le Village. And she set up home there, and she built her studio, and she sort of worked from there. And of course, moving to France the whole atmosphere was very, very different. In particular, the light was very different. The social environment of France at that time was very different. The French were dealing with this continuing wars in North Africa, their former colonies. There was a lot of information coming back into the French newspapers about that. Liz became very interested in that and rather obsessed with this man called General Oufkir. General Oufkir was sort of associated with the disappearance of various people, including Ben Barker. And there are lots of photographs in the French press of Oufkir and his henchmen all wearing these dark glasses. And so she had this sort of image of these goggled, helmeted people wearing dark glasses, And what interested her, I suppose, is by this time she was very interested in the idea of the aggressor, but also what the act of aggression did to the aggressor and how damaged it made them. And that actually there's this sort of an implied vulnerability in a way, in the fact that the aggressor is also vulnerable. It's not just the victim is vulnerable, but the aggressor, through that act of aggression, sort of is exposing vulnerability. And so when you look at these goggle heads and heads, one has clenched teeth, one has these very bald heads, one has this big thuggish sort of head, oversized head. You have these polished sunglasses, but also when you look at them, of course, as I stand here, I can see myself. You can see yourself. You look into them and you see yourself. And there's this sort of question of what are we all capable of? Where are we capable of going? How much do we collude? How much do we ignore? All those sort of aspects. So we have a series of heads. It's always worth looking at Liz's work in terms of the eyes, in terms of these sort of expressive forms. So one can have ravaged eyes, one can have eyes that are hardly there, you can have eyes that are hidden behind sunglasses, you can have eyes that are just sort of, yes, very sort of covered in these helmets in which you can you know, they're hardly visible. These sort of helmets are coming down here. This is an interesting piece. This is a study for Judas. So, and she always felt that Judas and Dying King were her most important pieces, as far as she was concerned, that she ever made. So Judas has a very complex history, you know. How do you tell the Christian story without Judas? But then as a character, he is this complex, he is the betrayer, but he is also sort of, there's this sort of necessary part to him. There's this thing of his striking out, but he's also trying to protect himself. So, you know, it's this duality always to look for in Frink's work. Here we've got some more soldiers' heads, a very ravaged soldier's head there. This one, you know, again with these eyes that are sort of almost sort of gouged out. Over there we have the Riachi figures, these big later thugs, these thugs that are sort of coming out of, again influenced by her being in Australia, and behind their painted faces, these sort of big, strong sort of men, but unthinking characters, and the sort of nature of sort of thuggishness. Something that we haven't shown here, which is an important part of this story of the idea of the aggressor and the vulnerability, is the notion of the hero. So quite often in classical literature and storytelling, you often have the warrior as the hero. For Frink, the warrior was the damaged soul, not the hero. And actually, she moves on to do this wonderful series of work for really the rest of her life. It's sort of informed by this, where she invents a new hero. And the new hero is the person who has been persecuted, the prisoner of conscience. She was a great supporter of Amnesty International and various other organizations like that. The new hero is the person who has gone through hell and come out the other side. And also for her, the new hero becomes other species, not the human species. And that's when she starts to look very strongly at other animal species. And one of the almost final pieces that she was working on was this series of works where you've got the baboon and the human, the male figure. And actually the male figure is reaching out to the baboon to really ask, you know, where have we gone wrong? Where are we going to go next? And you know, asking for help. So I think I've talked enough. I think I should just answer questions. Thank you, everyone. They started off as plaster, and now obviously they're being cast in bronze. Something I didn't mention, but because of your question I'll mention it, and something that's unique, well, not unique, but remarkable and slightly unique to Liz, is she never had any assistants. And if you think of Moore or Hepworth, eventually they have an army of assistants. They would make a maquette and they would hand over the piece to another sculptor or one of their assistants, and they would make up the piece. The only time that Liz had an assistant was in 1992 when she was dying of cancer, and she had this huge commission for Risen Christ, which is about 3 times my height. And she needed someone to help her build up. But all the carving she did herself. So she would work on the plaster, and then the plaster goes through this wonderful process at the foundry where molds and other things are made, and then they're cast in bronze. And normally they're small editions of the bronze. But what happens is that, again, for some artists, they would leave the bronze with the technicians at the foundry. For Liz, she was always at the foundry. Even with Risen Christ, weeks before she died, she was at the foundry still working on the bronzes, because the nature of pouring the molten bronze into the mold that's been made means that you have to have lots of runners and risers. You need to have lots of tubes going in and out. And so when they come in and out, you've got to then work the surface. So she would then work the bronze surface herself. She would be involved in the patination. In fact, there's a possibility that that didn't help the cancer, because she was doing these experiments with rather vicious chemicals and patinating things in her studio in Woolland. And then the other thing is she might like to change something. When you've made something in plaster and then it's cast in bronze, it may be that you want to make a slight adjustment. So you might want to move something. So she might have, the plaster is what the bronze is taken from. But in Liz's case and other artists, they might then decide that they'll have a little bit more of the bronze, added on, and then sort of some extra things sort of worked into that, because to get the scale right, what it looks like in plaster and then what it looks like in bronze can be subtly different. It's not always the case. It could be a pure translation with her working. The other thing is that Liz's surfaces are always evident of her hand. She's like a painter. There's nothing lazy about any of the surfaces. She's very aware of each mark, each gouge, how to animate those surfaces. There's a real painterly quality to her surfaces. She did, yes, and particularly when they moved to Woolland. So she lived in, and that started in France in a way. When she was in London, they were in flats, and then she would have her studios. And in photographs, we see pieces, around there. But in France, she started to enjoy perhaps putting things outside in the grounds. And when she moved to Woolland, that happened. This is the house in Dorset. That happened that's really why she and Ted bought Woolland. So not only did they have a family home, a place for her to build a studio. In fact, there were 2 studios in the end. But she also had these extensive grounds. So she was always setting up different juxtapositions with the sculptures, playing around, so we've got lots of photographs of the Riace figures in different parts of the grounds at Woolland, the mirage birds down by the lake, high up on the grass, all sorts of things. So, one sculpture next to another. She was very interested in how they worked outside, and she would have them inside the house as well.
Did she collect herself other?
She did, yes. On the whole, she mainly collected other painters' work, and people like Alfred Wallace, some of the European artists. She would swap. She was great friends with Mary Fedden. They would swap things, all sorts of things, and not a huge collection. She bought a lot of Aboriginal art when she was over in Australia, and she also supported lots of young artists. So within the archive, there's quite a lot of work by younger artists who she bought work just as well, because she was interested, and they might come and stay with her and do some work, and then at their exhibition she might buy a piece from them. I think any artist, any sort of really, and particularly an artist who knows what they want to say, is not going to be shy of being interested in other artists. So she was obviously interested in Giacometti, she was very interested in Rodin. She was very interested in Rodin's little figures, and she did a lot of little figures because she was interested in what you could convey within scale. So as well as large, having these small, intense figures, and then thinking about, she did this wonderful series of running men, which started with Rodin, with the idea of these Rodin's little figures. But for her, these running figures were not purely about movement. They were about people fleeing. They were about refugees. They were about people fleeing from terror. So there are lots of references, yes. And she was more than, and obviously the language of other artists is always interesting. If
sort of bistro.
Yes, and yes, not classical, but certainly more primitive, more ethnographic work, yes. But the power of that, which is why she responded so strongly to the Australian art as well. She was always very involved in any exhibitions that she took part in. So because she was very keen on placing and relationships between, it's a very good question, relationships between her sculptures, how they'd talk to one another, or perhaps the distance between them, the sort of the spaces in between them. She was really keen on having her work outside. The other thing that she really loved was the idea of unexpectedness. She uses that as a statement at some point, that she wants people to come across them perhaps by accident. So she loved the public commissions where people would turn a corner and they would find a sculpture, that by her, that they would walk past it every day, that they would start to have their own relationship with it. It's something that I've explored within the collection a lot. And nowadays she would have loved the idea of blogs. So I've got quite a good, accurate record of some of the blogging that goes on around some of her sculptures. There's a great series that relates to the work that went into Northern Ireland, where actually people became very attached to a particular group of sculptures that are in Belfast, particularly during the Troubles, and then later on, there's sort of they were included in novels, they were included in all sorts of things. But yes, she very much liked them to be part of everyday life. Yes, I think she liked the art to speak for itself, but she did also have wonderful, she was very attractive, incredibly sort of a wonderful person to sort of be around, and she attracted lots of filmmakers, lots of photographers, lots of interviews, and in those instances, she didn't keep a diary, she didn't keep sketchbooks or anything like that, but in those interviews, and we've got pages and pages and acres of those, the things that she felt, she sort of reveals quite knowingly and intelligently and thoughtfully, very thoughtfully, yeah. The mirage birds continue from next door, this idea of bird beast. And they started when she went to France. So when they were living in Le Village, she started to ride. She hadn't ridden since she was a child. she started to ride, and that's when she became interested in our relationship with horses. And so she took herself down to the Camargue a lot to look at initially to go to the Camargue to look at the wild horses that are down there. But then she became very interested in the birds and these sort of these low, flat, reflective waterscapes, watery landscapes. And the mirage birds come out of that. Because there's this sort of shimmering, half-seen quality. There's this bright light. So the surfaces, you've got this marriage, this shape-shifting again between sort of the bird, the beast. You've got the added to that, you've got the shimmering quality of the light there, the water reflections. And so she did a whole series of mirage birds. And the other thing that I love about them, particularly where we put them here, is how she loves playing with things almost being at the point of falling over. If you go and stand over there, you can sort of see that they're leaning rather wonderfully. And the foundry must have had quite a lot of fun trying to keep them upright. And yes, so this sort of tentative, this sort of added sense of not quite knowing what you're looking at, playing with sort of ideas, not being totally descriptive, and this sort of sense of things moving on to something else. Oh, thank you.